Great guest awaits you. We'll get to him in just a second. I actually had a conversation with him on my podcast, which is called The Edge with Mark Thompson. Some of you have been very nice and have clicked in. And I'll tell you that this guest, and we'll get right to the conversation in just a second. I just wanted to say that the reaction to his appearance on my podcast has been overwhelming. I mean, really, lots of emails, a lot of reactions. So Greg Jaczko, welcome. We are going to talk all about nuclear energy, and your book really states it all, because your book is called Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulator. And this man who we are speaking to, Greg Jaczko, is the former chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So if ever anyone had a sense of government and its relationship to big energy and this bizarre world of nuclear power, it's Greg Jaczko. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be with you.
What don't we know about nuclear power?
You know, I think a couple of things people don't really seem to know. Number one is that all nuclear power plants, especially the kind that we have in the United States, will eventually have accidents. That's probably really the biggest secret. The industry doesn't like to talk about that. They like to couch the ability of the industry in vague phrases about it's unlikely and low probability. But the reality is that accidents, because of the way these plants are designed, are really almost inevitable.
But aren't the design techniques being used in these various plants, aren't they being improved to the point that now we can build them with sort of a minimal risk of accident?
Well, it's a very difficult way. The risk is a very difficult description, because you're really talking about things that are certainly unlikely, but when they happen, they're very, very catastrophic. And the way the plants are designed, they're basically designed with a fundamental flaw, which is, whenever they shut down, they have all this energy and heat that has to somehow get released. Otherwise, you have a massive accident like we saw at the plants in Fukushima in Japan in 2011. And so if all the systems that are there don't work properly, then you will have this kind of overrun of heat, and that leads you to an accident. It leads to massive releases of radiation. That's just the basic physics of it.
And I want to talk about the promise, and I use air quotes with that, of nuclear energy. But because you mentioned Fukushima, I want to quickly touch on that first, and then we'll get to that again, quote, promise of nuclear energy, clean energy. Again, those are air quotes around that. But you were the man in charge when Fukushima was going on. I mean, in charge of our nuclear program, but you very much saw firsthand events unfold in Japan.
Yeah, that became a very significant part of the work that I did when I was the chairman of the NRC. And really what I saw firsthand was the consequences of a nuclear power plant action in a major industrialized country. And those consequences were really scared population, almost panic, and evacuation of over 100,000 people from their homes, many of them who haven't gone back to their homes or can't go back to them today. And fundamentally, it's a cleanup, if you can even call it that, that's going to take decades. So, this one accident basically wiped out all of the benefits and gains that the nuclear program in Japan had through its entire history with just one accident.
And that was a state-of-the-art nuclear reactor.
Yeah, it was a reactor. Well, it was a little bit of an older reactor design, but it's a reactor design that's in operation in many plants here in the United States, and kind of the fundamental design in a lot of reactors all over the world. So
you've stated sort of that possibility of this catastrophic event, and you've also stated sort of the inevitability of the catastrophic event, saying it's going to happen, is what you said. Is there anything to offset? Why are so many Greenies, members of the Sierra Club, just in general, I mean, saying, well, nuclear power is the only scalable energy source, even though there are risks associated with, we need to power it up worldwide?
I've really confronted this, this message that's been out there, and it seems like it's gaining steam. And, I can't tell you where it's coming from exactly, but what I can tell you is it's simply not true. Nuclear power cannot scale up fast enough and really within any reasonable cost in a time frame to deal with what has become the most pressing environmental issue, and that is the catastrophic effects of climate change.
Yeah, so you actually, I didn't interrupt, but in your book, you actually go through some of the numbers, and they just don't pencil out. I mean, your point is, look, you can scale up green energy way more than you can scale up nuclear energy.
Yeah, if I had to build, say, a gigawatt of clean energy in the next 5 years, I could do that with wind. I could do it with solar. I could do it with energy efficiency. I cannot do it with nuclear power. If I push that out to 10 years, I can't do it with nuclear power. So when I was the chairman of the NRC, we licensed a number of nuclear reactors, the first reactors in decades in this country. Of the 4 reactors we licensed, 2 of them have been canceled. The other 2 are continuing to be built, and the price tag is $30 billion. The amount of clean energy from renewable sources, even with battery stores that you could get from that same amount of money, is multiple times what you would get from these reactors if they're ever finished.
That just states it. I mean, that states it right out there. It's really an empty promise, the promise of nuclear power.
It is. It's an unfulfilled promise, and it's been that way really from the industry's inception. There's a certain effort, I think, right now to somehow paint this as a new technology, an emerging technology. Nuclear reactors and nuclear power, really in its current form, have been around for decades. And throughout that entire history, the industry, the technology has failed to live up to the promises. And every time something happens, they change the goalpost, or they come up with a new technology, a new design idea. And that's really where we are right now, is people are promising new reactors that will deal with all these problems. But those new reactor designs themselves are decades away from even being attempted for construction. So again, well beyond the time at which they could actually be a practical solution for the challenges of climate change.
I mean, Greg Jaczko, you ran the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. One of the things they're talking about now, again, in the conversation about nuclear power and the, again, quote, promise of nuclear power, is these smaller reactors, not the big Fukushima type plants we're talking about, but smaller reactors that could, in a place like China, with these sort of vast amounts of real estate to cover, could exist in many different villages or across the landscape. Just can you give us a minute about that? What are they talking about?
Well, the idea with a small modular reactor is you take a nuclear reactor and you break it up into smaller parts. And the reason for that is that you minimize the effects of an accident. Because if you've got a smaller reactor, you can't get as much radiation released. But at the same time, you also minimize the one virtue of nuclear power from an energy production perspective, which is very dense energy generation. So these smaller reactors are around 50 megawatts. And that's kind of a standard size for a small reactor. If I wanted to build 50 megawatts of clean energy, I could do that today very easily with solar power, with wind, with a combination of a small amount of wind. And I can do that and get it up and running in 2 years, a year and a half from the time maybe I get permits. For the nuclear side of that, they're talking about a decade or so until they can do a demonstration reactor and then perhaps deploy them all over the world. But from a materials control perspective, from a non-proliferation hazard, we don't really want to be deploying lots and lots of small reactors all over the world. That's not really the right solution. It creates so many other problems that simple solutions like renewable energy and wind and geothermal, depending on your applications, are able to solve today. And in fact, they're actually cheaper than any of these small modular reactors could be. So again, it's a promise that's built around, it's trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. It's really trying to solve the problem of how do you make nuclear better. It's not solving the problem of how do you get clean energy deployed in a fast time frame at the lowest cost. I mean, the solution to that is efficiency and renewables.
Your argument is so clean, it makes so much sense. And so when something is happening that doesn't make sense, in this case that there's still a rap about nuclear energy, I always go to money. So is there a big push on the part of the corporate, if you will, is there a big corporate push on the part of nuclear power? Did you see it when you were head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? How come, based on what you just said, nuclear isn't even relevant anymore?
Yeah, it is a big corporate push because at the end of the day, there's a lot of companies in this country that have nuclear reactors. There's a lot of industries that are built around the promise of nuclear reactors. And we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. And these companies don't want to give up on this technology because they haven't invested a lot of money in it. They haven't invested an entire industry in it, and they're holding on firm to that. I mean, it's much like what we see really with the oil and gas industry, with kind of the resistance to electrification of vehicles, to any kinds of efforts to increase fuel efficiency standards, because you've got this massive industry behind it that doesn't want to give up, and has shareholders and investors and pension funds and all these things that want to preserve those assets. But for the sake of the planet, we need to think about more than money. We need to think about the future we're leaving for our children, and that means moving away from technologies that cannot meet the climate risk, and certainly that means moving away from nuclear.
When you were there, we have to wrap up, but let me just quickly ask you, because you were there running the commission, and you are as you sort of a unapologetic rogue nuclear regulator. Were there any moments where you thought, wow, this is just amazing what's happening with big industry, with the nuclear power industry and my commission, how I really am not powerful enough to push back on this industry?
Yeah, I mean, there were certainly moments like that. One of the most significant was when I was dealing with the reforms following the Fukushima accident. And the staff of the agency produced a really fantastic report that had common sense changes. And as soon as that report was out, I was hearing from almost everyone about how it did too much. It was going to be hurtful to the industry. And I thought, this is really the wrong reaction. People need to embrace these reforms and do what we can to make these reactors safer. And that was when I really saw the power of this industry. At that time, people were more worried about finishing the work we were doing to license these new reactors than they were trying to make those reactors safe. And I, in fact, opposed those new reactors because they weren't doing enough to really deal with these Fukushima reforms. So, unfortunately, even today, most of those reforms have been ignored and pushed aside. And I think that's just a tragedy. And unfortunately, it's probably something that will hurt us, if we don't move away from nuclear technology soon.
The book is Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulatory, a rogue nuclear regulator. Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulator. Former chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Greg Jaczko. What an eloquent spokesperson you are for this entire movement, the green energy movement. And you've really seen firsthand the dangers of nuclear power, and it's just a real treat to talk to you. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks, Mark. It was a real pleasure. And, I say it's nice to be talking about something where the right solution for the planet's the right solution for your pocketbook. And that's really a nice position to be in.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.